at the bottom, and if I see a lot of roots coming out of the bottom, I'm like, oh, that one's been in there too long, let me look for another one. But if it is pot bound or root bound, we actually can take those roots and tear them apart a little bit. It's okay, you can actually score it with a knife gently. You don't want to, I have been known to pull off some of the ones on the bottom. If it looks exactly like the bottom of the pot and it's just really dense, I'll cut them off with a clean knife, or I'll just tear them apart and just pull those off and throw them in my compost pile. You can do a little bit of that as you're transplanting, because that plant, if it's put in with those roots that tight, they will very unlikely not loosen up. So they need to be teased away from that tightness. They will continue just to stay that way, and they won't spread out, and they won't go out into the soil to get the nutrients and everything that it needs. So you want to loosen up those tight roots on them. You want to make sure you fill in any gaps. If you're putting more than one plant in a pot, you might have some little nooks and crannies. Make sure that those are being filled in with soil, because the minute you water, that soil is going to fill and you'll start to see all those gaps, and you don't want that either. And then make sure it is also even on the top, and that you have some room on the top. So just like my bottle of water here has some room, if this was filled up, obviously I couldn't put any more water in here, right? Well, if you have soil on your pot all the way to the very top, when you go to water it, that water is going to run over the edge of your pot and just make a mess. So give that water room to be able to sit on the top, soak in, and get down into the actual plant itself. You also want to always use moist soil when you're planting in a container. Quite often when you get that bag of soil fresh from the big box store or the nursery, you open it up, it's moist inside, right? Sometimes you feel it's kind of wet. That's perfect. You want it that way. When you have that soil bag that you haven't used for a while, you kept it in your shed or in the back of the yard or what have you, and it gets all dried out, dump it into a bucket or a wheelbarrow. Get it a little bit moist before you use it, because dry soil like that is what we call hydrophobic. Hydro, water, phobic, repelling. So it's afraid of the water, right? Okay, it doesn't have emotions, it's not really afraid, but it does repel it. If you've ever made pancakes, or you've ever made bread, or any time you have to mix a liquid with a flour, you'll notice how much it takes you to mix it in together. And that's exactly what happens with our soil. So if you have a pot that the soil has actually dried up in a lot, and it's actually pulled away from the edge of the pot, when you go to water it, the water comes running right out because it ran down the gap between the pot and the soil, not the soil itself, because that soil cannot absorb that water. That's when you need to put that pot into a bucket and let it soak up from the bottom, and it might take a couple hours to do that. So if you use moist soil when you're transplanting into a container, you will not have that problem. And the same thing goes for a brand new garden bed. If you're starting a brand new garden bed and it's completely dry, you want to make sure that you add some moisture into that before you plant into it for the same reasons. So let's talk about watering. Does every herb need the same amount of water? Well, of course not. Wouldn't that be too easy? So that also means, should they all go in the same container? No. Or even in the same garden bed? Yes, depending on where you put it in the bed, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So these are just, again, another short list of what likes more moisture and what likes less. So I know for sure rosemary doesn't need a lot of water, and I know that because I have my rosemary bush in my front yard and it's not on a drip. And it didn't miss a beat this summer. I had other things die that I'd had forever, but this rosemary bush didn't get brown at all. So it got just enough water from surrounding areas or from a rain that we got or what have you. Once in a while, yes, I turned the hose on it, but it wasn't on a weekly or daily drip system. So rosemary can definitely take less water. Lavender, which is an herb, we think of it as a flower, but it's an herb, can also take less water, but it still needs water. So these are the things that as you're looking to add vegetables or herbs to your garden, take the time to go online and research them. If you can't find it in one of our publications, research it to see what it needs, and is it a high water use or low water use, just to make sure that you're giving it what it needs as it's growing. If you're going to put them into a garden bed, I said yes and no, they can go together. Just make sure that you're putting them in areas that get the amount of water that it needs. Meaning, I have a garden bed that has drip lines that go across it. And I know there are certain parts of it that where the little emitter is on the drip line, that little wetting circle is wetter there, but if I go over an inch or two, it's drier. So although I know the water's gone underground and I can't see where the water all goes, I also know that I have some dry spots in my vegetable garden bed that I could put those plants that don't need a lot of water. So again, some of this is based on your experience and based on what you observe, which is part of our biggest learning, is observing how things work in your own garden and beds. Lemon balm is another thing that's great to grow, especially if you're a chef and you like cooking any kind of Asian food or Thai food, because lemon, not lemon balm, what's it? Lemongrass is what I meant to say. Lemongrass. It grows well in a garden bed, or it grows well in the landscape because it will grow bush-like and looks like a lot of the other grasses that you might see growing here in the desert. Lemon balm is great for herbs, and I mean for a tea. It's a great herb for tea. I like to mix it with edible hibiscus, not the hibiscus that we see as decorations, but the edible hibiscus, and we make a great tea with it. It's very high in vitamin C. So it's kind of a fun one to grow, and it does pretty well here in the heat. All right, I'm going to just take a breath here and say, are there any questions that anybody has so far? I'm going to talk now about designing herb gardens and some pretty things. So we got some of the technical stuff out of the way, and then we'll come back to it in a minute.
I brought some milkweed seed from Chicago that attracts butterflies. Is that same milkweed from Chicago going to survive in our heat here?
She's asking about milkweed from Chicago and will it survive here? I don't know. I know that we talk about desert milkweed here quite a bit, so it may or may not. It may need an environment that's a little shadier and a little bit more moisture than some of our desert milkweed. So you might want to, if you brought the seeds and you need to do some research just on what the plant itself needs, soil may not be the issue. It just might be sun. If it says full sun from Chicago, you know it's not full sun from here, right? Yeah. Okay. All right, let's go on. Look at a few pictures. So herb gardens in a single pot, wonderful. You get a lot of, some of our more leafier, taller herbs can really make a statement. Something like rosemary or lavender is one of those examples. You can grow rosemary or lavender in a pot, but I would grow them by themselves. I wouldn't combine them with other things because they want to get bushy. So if you put lavender in with another plant, it might want to take over that pot and your other plant won't look, you won't see it. Same thing with rosemary. Rosemary wants to get a couple feet across given the size of the container. So the bigger the container, the bigger it'll get, but it also will kind of take over that pot, and so anything else in it may just get overshadowed by the plant. But what about if we did multiple pots and multiple plants? We put them together, nestled them together. You know, you could do all the same color pot, or you could do different kinds of pots, different heights, different shapes. You could do whatever aesthetically pleasing to yourself to make it work for you. And that way you could have them all nestled together because they'll create that humidity around each other, which is kind of nice to have. It also kind of helps with some of the, bees that come in, which is good for our plants in general. But if the trick is to stick to odd numbers. So they say in design, in general, that odd numbers of things look better together than even numbers. There's also, if you're putting things into one pot, and this can go for flowers and go for herbs and go for vegetables, it's all about design again. It's our concept of thriller, spiller, and filler. Well, thriller, filler, spiller. So the thriller is the tall plant, and this to me looks like rosemary. They've got a rosemary in here. They may have pruned it up to be more like a botanical kind of a plant. And then they've got down here, looks to me like maybe even some, looks fuzzy, like a fuzzier leaf. So that could be any herb really, maybe some balm of some kind, bee balm or lemon balm. And then this could be thyme. No, not thyme, it's too small. Maybe an oregano of some sort. But anyway, the key is a tall one when it fills, and then one that will eventually kind of cover over the edge. That's your spiller. And that gives you that aesthetically pleasing look. You can get that by combining herbs and flowers as well. So think again about what you might like to have as a patio, as an impact, as maybe you're walking up, you want some color. Get something that tall perhaps is your flower, and then your other ones, your filler and your spiller, could be your herbs. I'm going to go through some companion planting, and I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. A lot of this can be found online in your own personal research, but it's a lot of detail. So I just want to give you some highlights about why certain things like to be planted together. So companion plants means that one of the plants has a beneficial impact on the other. And it could be that they actually bring in things like bees and butterflies to pollinate it. It could also be that the bugs themselves don't like the other plant, so they won't come to that pot or that garden, part of the garden. So that's the beneficial part of it. But if you look at this one, it says here that dill wards off harmful insects, such as spider mites, aphids, cabbage lopers. So planted by those that might get infested with these plants. So you might want to plant dill by cabbage, right? Some of the other similar companion herbs are things like chives, basil, parsley, cilantro, tarragon, very aromatic herbs, right? So those, dill is very aromatic. So those are I don't know, I'm not an entomologist. I don't know if the bugs don't like the smell. That's what they've said about marigolds. The bugs don't like the way it smells, but I don't really know based on entomology. But we all know that there are certain things that help our gardens out. So dill can be beneficial to your garden in general, as can basil. It's a great one to have both in the herb as well as your vegetable garden because it repels, as I said earlier, tomato hornworms, the whiteflies, aphids, and mosquitoes. So some of our aromatic plants like lavender and rosemary are also good for detracting mosquitoes. So if you have a patio, you have a deck area, you might want to plant those around there because, again, maybe the mosquitoes don't like the way they taste or the way they smell or what have you. Also, basil grows very well with these other herbs, parsley, chamomile, oregano, but it does prefer the company of vegetables better. So I always put my basil in my vegetable garden bed, mixed often with my tomatoes this time of year. Our tomatoes won't last all summer here if you're not used to gardening here. They'll go through about early June, and then when it gets too hot, they start to kind of look pretty bad, but your basil will continue on throughout the summer. Basil loves the heat. Our lemon-scented herbs like lemon thyme, lemon verbena, and lemon basil grow well if you plant them all together. And they're really fun to cook with because they give you that little hint of lemon and anything, like if you're cooking fish or even putting them into soups, they do give that lovely lemon scent. And they also have a lemon flavor. They have a lemon scent, so they're kind of nice in bouquets, or maybe put them into the bathroom or into a shower for the steaming of the scent into the air. And most Mediterranean herbs need good, strong sunlight. Think about the Mediterranean countries, Spain, Greece, Italy, hot. They get as hot in the summertime as we do, and the same plants that grow here grow there. So any of the Mediterranean herbs are really gonna love our Arizona summers, given that they get enough water and enough shade in the heat of the sunshine. So that's sage, which is really good for soups and stews. Of course, we talked about rosemary and lavender already. Tarragon, oreganos, all the oreganos. There's, different kinds of oreganos. There's marjoram. So there's so many different herbs that you can grow based on what you like to cook with. And chives are kind of nice to have because you can chop chives and cook them in your eggs. You can put them into soups. You can make chive butter and serve it on bread. So it's either garlic chive or onion chives. And, they're just little green grasses. So they're kind of nice to grow because they're easy to cook with and they last a long time. They sometimes will flower, and that's okay. You can either use the flower in your cooking as well. any of the flowers from most of these herbs are edible. They're not going to hurt you. They're just your plant's going to seed. It's the reproduction cycle. So as I said here, you can also cook them with things like, or plant them with things like mustard greens, and carrots, and tomatoes again. So here's some more inspiration. There are hanging wall planters that these vegetables and fruit and flowers will grow well in, so that's another way to grow them. So you see that our herbs don't need a lot of space for their roots because they have a small root system. Not like some of our bigger vegetable plants that get really tall have a larger root system. So you can put them in smaller spaces. So that's kind of a cool one that I came across. So let's talk about when do you want to harvest your herbs. So the rule of thumb is to harvest them before they go to flower because that's when the intensity is strongest in the actual leaf itself. That's where all the energy is going into the leaf. Once the plant goes to reproduction cycle, which is what the flower is, it puts its energy into reproducing. And so then the essential oils, which is what we're using in the leaf, is just a little less potent. And you also want to get them, never harvest more than about a third of the plant at a time. The reason I like growing herbs and I like buying them by plant sometimes versus by seed is because I have instant food. An herb plant, when you put into the garden from a transplant, you could harvest it the same day. I wouldn't take much because it could stress the plant, and anytime we cut plant, we stress it. So when you're harvesting the leaves from your basil plant, you are stressing it, and this is why they recommend no more than 1/3 at a time. Plus you want to leave the leaves there so it can absorb the sunlight and do all of its things like photosynthesis and bring the chlorophyll in, do all the things that plants need to do to grow. You need that leaf for that to happen. You also want to do it earlier in the day if possible, but that's not always possible when I think about this at 5 o'clock at night when I'm cooking my meal and I want to run out and get a few leaves from a herb plant. Don't worry. You don't have to say, oh, I didn't do it in the morning before I started cooking. It's okay. But the reason we say that is because if it's hotter out, it's stressful on the plant and you don't want to stress your plant more. So usually early in the day. How do you use herbs? Well, cooking is probably the most obvious, right? So, what is the difference between an herb and a spice? Anybody know? It's the part of the plant. So spices are truly mostly the ground seeds. And spices are the herbs. Wait, did I just say that backwards? I said backwards. So herbs, the leafy part is what we use for and you buy, you say this is my spice rack, right? You have all the same things in them, but the herbs are really what they are. They're just dried. And when you cook, you use less dried than you do fresh. Is that correct, chefs out there? Yeah, because the potency is stronger when it's dried. Also, you can dry your own herbs at home. I don't suggest putting them in the oven because we have such a dry climate here anyway. I usually rinse them off to get all the dust off of them. You can hang them up somewhere, or you can just lay them on a plate or a paper towel on your counter and let them dry by themselves. And then put them in a bag or put them in another jar. I save all my jars when I empty something and I refill it if I can on my own. But why not make something with it and then preserve that? So that's pesto is a classic example. And herb butter is another classic example. So pesto can be frozen. It's made with olive oil or some kind of oil, most often olive oil, and a ground up leaf. So I've made carrot top pesto. I've made basil pesto. I've made lemon basil pesto. Just whatever flavor you're looking for to flavor either your roasted vegetables, your potatoes, your pasta, whatever you like. Try it with whatever green you have. I don't know if lettuce leaf pesto would be very good, but you get the picture, right? And then you can freeze it. I freeze it in ice cube trays, pop them out, put them in a Ziploc bag, and keep them in the freezer throughout the summer. And then I already have what I need if that herb is not growing at that time. So it makes it kind of easy to do. And you can make flavored oils and flavored vinegars. Just make sure you look the recipes up online and follow what they suggest to make sure that you're getting the right consistency, the right potency, and that you're doing it in a healthy and safe way. So I talked about freezing already. I quite often, people say you can use in cold water, because you can just throw that right into a soup base, right? You could throw it into a pasta base, but also if you use oil in your cooking, you could freeze them in oil so that you can just pop them out. Test your ice cube tray, see how many tablespoons of water or liquid it is. That might give you some idea of how much you're actually putting into your soup as well. And you can also say, okay, I put a teaspoon of fresh herb in this 1 tablespoon of water in my tray, and then just mark your baggie accordingly. So you know you have 1 teaspoon of that herb that you're now putting into your recipe. And we talked about drying herbs as well. So many of them will dry well, but they also will mold if you don't give enough air around them. So that's why we suggest drying either by hanging them or putting them somewhere where they can actually dry outside. Sometimes people have an old screen or something like that that they can dry quickly and not be moist when you put them in the paper, because they will mold on you, and then you're out of luck. Okay, I am ready to take some questions now. I do have some, there are some books in the back. I think, do we have the Herb Association book in the back? Do you guys know if we have that? Oh, they're not selling anything. Oh, never mind. Well, you can go online. There is a group called the Arizona Herb Association. They meet once a month. They talk only about herbs, and they have a great resource book. And we have some other Master Gardener books I think you can buy at the Master Gardener website that will give you some information about herbs as well. All right, now I'll entertain questions.
I want to run like a small herb pharmacy, like little store. I noticed that we have a lot of herb shops in Arizona. How do they go about like collecting those herbs and put them in a jar, which we're kind of like persistent for I guess a couple of years? Do they just take the herbs, put them in like a dehydrator, and then they just put them in a jar or something that just preserves it?
That's a great question. He said he's interested in doing it a little bit more in bulk, and so how do we actually get the herbs into the jar like we see at the store? I don't know all the ways, but I imagine that they have some kind of major dehydration process going on versus just sitting it on your counter. And I am sure due to our health laws, they've got a lot of requirements. Sometimes you might even ask our extension office, because we do help a lot of different things. I don't know if our extension office might have some information for you, but also look up for the state of Arizona, what your, they call it, I think it's like a home chef, that kind of thing. They have all these rules on your sanitation and guidelines for that too. So just make sure you follow that. But they probably do some massive dehydrating, crumbling them up, and then putting them in a container and sealing it.
Can plastic also work versus jars, glass jars?
Can plastic work versus glass jars? Yes, it can. And I see a lot of them sold in plastic containers. I think a lot of it is preference by the individual. Any other questions?